inexperienced Diet Pep clone, or a bold gamble by Bowley which makes Chelsea a near certainty for top 4 next season? Just how good is Enzo Maresca? In possession, Maresca's 4-3-3 in reality takes the form of a 3-2-5 formation. Now, the use of the double pivot in the build-up is a key feature of their possession play, and it features a genuine deep-lying playmaker in Harry Winks, who's utterly integral, and usually an inverting fullback, Ricardo Pereira, who replicates what Geertruida did for Slot's Feyenoord, which we discussed in our last video. But what hasn't really been mentioned is that Maresca has a bit more variety in his build-up approach, with centre-back sometimes progressing forward to replace the right-back inverting. Now, this unpredictability makes them a challenging team to press against and force into errors, and that's evidenced by the fact that they've got a pass accuracy rate of 89.1%, the second highest in the championship, and when it comes to handling pressure, they're masters, boasting a pass per defensive action against of 17.26, and that makes them the second best press-resistant team in the championship. Now, it's worth noting that Chelsea do have a player that fits the deep-lying playmaker profile in its true form, but in my opinion, that isn't Caicedo or Enzo Fernandez, it's Romeo Lavia, who once played under Maresca at Manchester City. Now, interesting debates will rage on as to whether any of these will eventually fill that Maresca brief, but if they don't, an interesting signing would be someone like Matt Zwiefer, but can he handle that step up to the Premier League? Just further honing in on the build-up, Maresca favours a short, precise style of play, and his goalkeeper plays a very important yet daring role, almost integrating into the backline from very deep positions to help initiate attacks. And it's worth noting that Leicester's centre-backs are way more involved in the build-up and rack up far more touches than Chelsea's centre-backs. Now, that could be perceived as a negative, i.e. like a Guardiola City. Maresca's side passes from side to side across the backline just to establish control. And it's true that they make the 4th fewest long passes in the championship, so they're not a super direct team in terms of hitting the long ball, but they do switch the play 4.72 times per game, which is the second highest in the league. So in stark contrast to, say, Arteta, Declan Rice spoke about how Arsenal like to play the ball, constantly down the same flank, rarely switching it, but Maresca's team are a lot more dynamic in possession. In fact, in terms of progression, they're very good at getting it into Vardy quickly, not necessarily using a long ball, but they lead the league alongside Southampton in terms of number of passes into the final third. But in contrast to Saints, they produce more progressive passes per 90 and are second in the league in that respect. So that shows that they've got this relentless drive to get forward. In fact, this energetic front foot possession game is further illustrated by the speed of their play, their tempo. They produce 16.1 passes per minute, which puts them second in the league. So again, that's quite similar to Chelsea currently under Pochettino, where they're also producing 16.2 passes per minute. And both these sides are seen as very attractive, interesting sides to watch who play at quite a fast pace. In the league, Maresca prefers close-range control shots, again a rather Guardiola-esque trait, over long-distance attempts. And his Leicester side ranked 3rd least in terms of taking long shots. And that's in real contrast to Chelsea, who took the 4th most long shots in the league last season. So it kind of begs the question, will Palmer get as much license to express himself from range? Now, in terms of XG, Leicester were the best chance creation side in the league by quite a margin with 84.9 XG, and they exceeded it with actual goals scored of 89 goals. As for Chelsea, they never really struggled to create chances with a healthy 74.5 XG, bearing in mind they play in a tougher league, and 77 goals scored. Although it's worth noting that for a large spell of the season, their finishing didn't quite match up to their chance creation. Now, in terms of central-based creativity, Leicester heavily reliant on Dewsbury Hall to provide that creative thrust, and similarly Chelsea reliant on their own left-footed maestro in Palmer. Neither side really had a large array of players who can provide that incisiveness in central areas compared to, say, Man City. So Maresca is not someone who, like Guardiola, is really going to flood it with playmakers across sort of the midfield or the attacking forward line. Now, Leicester didn't really majorly utilise width, and they featured 12th in the league for crosses. Now, one explanation for this is that instead of relying on down the line overlap outlet who's going to go down the line and put a cross in, and Chelsea faced similar issues under Pochettino, being one of the worst sides in terms of producing crosses. On the plus side, Unlike Chelsea, crosses come evenly from both flanks with, the wingers being the primary source, and occasionally midfielders like Dewsbury Hall do drift into half spaces to deliver inverted crosses. Now, one aspect of crossing where Leicester did actually excel is in delivering 6-yard crosses, leading the league with 139, indicating a preference for cutbacks, again a rather Guardiola-esque trait. Additionally, in terms of headed goals, they lead the league in headed chances with 101. Now, this showcases their efficiency in aerial play. So whilst there wasn't a large volume of crosses being delivered, when the ball was put in, it was done with a high degree of thought, and the chance was maximised in Leicester's favour. In contrast, Chelsea had the second worst accuracy for crosses in the league and the second least headed efforts on goal. So Maresca, his attack is definitely been more calculated and more efficient than Pochettino's. Just touching upon set pieces, Chelsea had more varied set piece delivery, in-swing versus out-swing. It was quite balanced, whereas Maresca's Leicester is more geared towards in-swing, which is a bit like Arteta. Finally, in terms of dribbling, Leicester use it to strategically break open defences, especially given their limited overlap play. It's almost used as a plan B if their passing game hasn't carved open the opposition. And due to the lack of the overlap, the players are almost expected to produce miracles and complex dribbles, even when outnumbered. So I think that could suit Madueke more than it suits Mudryk, especially while his confidence is quite low at the moment. Defensively, Maresca's Leicester stood out for their remarkable resilience and organisation. They had a highly organised defensive structure characterised by a high defensive line and strategic pressing. In fact, they had the highest line in the Championship, an average defensive action taking place almost 18.8 yards away from goal. That aggressive approach allowed them to defend high up the pitch, disrupting opponents' build-up play early, forcing turnovers and creating immediate counter-attacking opportunities. In fact, they had the second best defence in the league. They only conceded 41 goals compared to an XG against of 42.7, so pretty similar, and that demonstrates their effectiveness in preventing goal-scoring opportunities. In contrast, Pochettino's Chelsea were a bit of a mess, conceding 63 goals against an XG. Now, in terms of intensity, Leicester had a similar press per defensive action to Chelsea, so very high intense, 10.23 versus 10.71, so slightly more intense than even a Pochettino side. But it's their pressing structure that's particularly noteworthy. From the outset, it looks like a 4-1-4-1, but very rapidly it becomes a 3-1-1-4-1, which is quite convoluted, with Vardy leading the charge, and then that initial press by Vardy is followed by a line of 4 midfielders, including Ndidi, who jumps from midfield, but Winks typically sits behind to intercept and recycle possession. And this coordinated effort ensures that if the ball is played long, then the next sort of surprise move is that the buccaneering Vestergaard abandons the backline to step up to win the aerial duel, whilst the remaining defenders kind of tuck in to form a compact unit of 3 to sweep up and regain control. And this is systematic. It happens pretty much every time they're looking to press and win the ball. In contrast, Chelsea's approach to dealing with long balls was more individual-centric, more off the cuff, just reliant on aerial duel prowess, with one centre-back sort of going in for the header and the other one sweeping, a bit more old school, whereas this Maresca type of press and how to deal with it is a lot more structured. A final note on the press is that Leicester tend to wait for the ball to be passed out wide before the line behind Vardy goes in for that press more aggressively, and you need a really hard-working centre-forward who's going to screen in front of that front four and sweep from side to side, waiting for that moment to press. In terms of winning their defensive duels, Leicester ranked 6th in the league with a success rate of 61.9. And that shows that this was a team that's relatively strong in terms of individual defensive capabilities and ability to win crucial battles. In comparison, Chelsea's success rate was 57.4%, the lowest in the league. And that indicates why Chelsea was so open, so vulnerable, despite the embarrassment of riches in terms of talent in their squad. What's also intriguing is the sheer amount of work that Chelsea midfielders were being asked to undertake as part of Poch's pressing structure, and yet this didn't lead to defensive stability. And that's a sign that Caicedo and Enzo were not particularly well suited as a pairing in terms of producing intense pitch coverage and carrying out ball winning responsibilities. And that's something that Maresca needs to touch upon to ensure that his off-the-ball structure is more coherent and effective than Pochettino's was. It's also worth noting that Leicester were difficult to break down due to their disciplined off-the-ball structure in terms of the backline. James Justin was effectively a third centre-back, and with Ricardo Pereira not really going on overlaps and joining in with the midfield with Harry Winks, who was sitting, it meant that there was always 5 players ready to defend once the ball was lost. Whereas for Chelsea, for large spells of the season, they didn't really have a cohesive defensive structure off the ball, or one which was consistent in terms of its personnel. In conclusion, Maresca is not just a Pep clone, he's definitely got some nuanced traits which he can safely call his own. He's a bit more like an Arne Slot, in fact. The reliance on a deep-lying playmaker, the back three, which is very much a proper back three off the ball, the approach to dealing with aerial duels, these are differentiating traits which are unique to him. His Chelsea side will undoubtedly be more structured than last year's iteration at Chelsea. The question is, will that be a good thing, and who will be the big casualties and beneficiaries of his arrival? I think defensively Chelsea will benefit from his arrival. His eye for detail off the ball is superior to Pochettino, especially once the press is bypassed. But in possession, whilst the eye test was at times extremely impressive from some of the Leicester games I saw, it is true that with the lack of overlapping, it could potentially get stale once the opposition get wise to his style of play. And it remains to be seen how Maresca would cope with the necessary in-game tweaks then to open up the opposition. I suspect once the players get used to it initially, they will benefit from the stringent structure he will provide on the ball. In terms of personnel, I believe Maresca will require a goalkeeper who's very, very comfortable in possession. Now, early rumours suggest that he will favour Sanchez out of the current roster, but long term, I don't think if that player is probably going to be good enough to be a title-winning number one. A long-term option could be a Verbruggen type of keeper if he blossoms and becomes less error-prone. In terms of the backline, if Maresca was to basically deploy the same system he did at Leicester, which is not necessarily a given, but let's just assume that that is the case, Chelsea would need one fullback inverting and one defensive fullback who can operate as a wide centre-back. On paper, Chalobah and Cucurella are the best fits for a Maresca system, but where does that leave the likes of Gusto and James? In terms of centre-back pairings, Chelsea would need one aerially aggressive centre-back and one sweeper. Someone like De Ligt would be a great fit for the aggressive centre-back, but from the current roster, Colwill, Disasi are probably their best fits for that role, and the sweeper probably Badiashile and Fofana. In terms of the deep-lying playmaker role, I don't see Enzo Fernandez having the same level of discipline as Winks off the ball or providing the same level of pitch coverage, but he would have that deep-lying comfort to fulfill the deep-lying playmaker brief on the ball. Caicedo for me doesn't rack up enough passes, but he is more stable off the ball and has superior pitch coverage. So neither is an ideal fit and would need to adapt to make it work. As I've mentioned earlier in the video, the natural fit would probably be Lavia, but he's not really played since he's joined, and who knows if he can handle that step up to Chelsea's expectations. Now, the other two midfielders have to provide balance. One has to be a hard-working box-to-box midfielder who's slightly more defensive in profile, and the other hard-working advanced 8-10 hybrid. Now, in theory, Gallagher does fit that profile, but I personally would look at someone like Adam Wharton to come in and be that type of player. And the other midfielder is obviously going to have to be Cole Palmer. In terms of the front three, they'd need to be dynamic, and the wingers need to be able to operate in isolation. For me, Madueke fills that brief for sure. Jackson would be that hard-working spearhead, although I'm sure Maresca would expect his striker to be a bit more efficient in front of goal. And in terms of the left wing, well, Sterling in theory is a better fit than a Mudryk. For me, Mudryk would need to have an attitude adjustment, become more confident on the ball to fulfill what Maresca expects from his wide men. And he's not going to have that overlap, which for long I've been saying Mudryk needs an overlapping fullback to free him up to make those darted, penetrating runs. But Maresca wants his wingers almost to stay out wide and be more providers. So that's slightly, potentially going to be an issue. He also expects his wingers to press hard and perform a lot of carries. So it remains to be seen whether Mudryk's face will fit in this Maresca system. In short, I don't think Maresca is the man who can solve that Enzo Fernandez and Mudryk conundrum. There needs to be an adjustment either made from him or the players for it to be a really functional relationship at the top level. I do think though that Chelsea will be more structured in more phases of play or more tighter unit, but I do have concerns as to the end game and whether Maresca is the seamless fit for the big investments Chelsea have already made. And that lack of seamless fit was a big reason why Pochettino was eventually shown the door, as for long spells he failed to get the best out of his big players. As for Maresca, it's so early into his managerial career, it's difficult to make a judgment as to how adaptable he is if his plan A isn't quite suited to some of the big names in his squad, or whether he's got that aura to just clean up shop and say, hey, you guys are not fitting into my system, you guys are obstacles and you need to be got rid of. So it's all slightly a bit up in the air, but slightly excited and intrigued to see what he can produce. Anyway guys, hope you enjoyed the video. Please like, share and subscribe, and see you guys again next time. Bye.